Welcome everybody to our session. We want to make just a quick announcement for anyone who has their cameras turned on. I need to. This session is recorded. It will be published publicly and may be included in other digital and printed regional English language office or RELO, the U.S. Embassy from Lima, and the U.S. Department of State in order to promote exchange programs and public diplomacy efforts. If you do not want to appear in recording, please turn off your camera. You can still ask and answer questions in the chat, which is not being captured in the video. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will be starting very, very soon.
Morning, everyone.
Let me start by introducing you to Dr. Gabriel Diaz Maggioli. He's Senior Professor of TESOL Methods at Instituto de Profesores Artigas in Uruguay. We have the pleasure to have him with us today. We're going to be listening and learning so much from him. And then at the end, we will have 15 minutes to ask questions. So if you come up with any doubts, any questions, make sure to make note of them so nothing just skips your mind, and we can make sure to present these questions to Dr. Gabriel, who I know will be, and he is very excited to respond to these questions. Dr. Gabriel, welcome, and the microphone or the camera is all yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's great to see familiar faces. I cannot see anybody now except my presentation, but I've seen some familiar faces. Great to see you guys. Thank you for attending, and what an honor it is to be presenting in this virtual conference. And I hope that what I'm going to share with you today is useful for your contexts. Let me explain to you where I'm coming from. I'm coming from Uruguay, South America, in what is now a very sunny day, but very windy and very cold. We have 8 degrees centigrade only today. And in the wee hours of the morning when I woke up, it was 3 degrees centigrade. So we're still not in springtime. My role is, I'm a teacher educator. I'm the national coordinator for the teaching programs in foreign languages for the Ministry of Education in Uruguay. And what I'm going to share with you today is something that happened as a consequence of the pandemic. And I teach a methods course, the first methods course in a 4-year program. This methods course has an attached teaching practice. We were supposed to start classes on March the 16th, and on March the 14th, all the schools were closed. So I had to teach a methods course to students who were new to teaching and who had never had any teaching experience whatsoever, but they were not going to see their students face to face. They had to use technology to teach them. Needless to say, they didn't know how to teach with technology, and as an aside, neither did I much. I had experience teaching online. So I started thinking of how I could best support my students, my student teachers, in their teaching practice with a cooperating teacher. They have a cooperating teacher who was also going through the motions of learning how to teach online without losing the quality of teaching that is necessary for our students in public education in Uruguay. My student teachers teach only public education schools, who are the most underprivileged parts of the population in general. So what I'm going to share with you is a process that I developed based on theory, based on practice. And I'm going to ask everybody who has their mic on to please shut it down because we're hearing noises and it's a little bit distracting. Thank you. And my first thought was, how am I going to get these people to actually learn how to teach without having face-to-face contact with her students most of the times, with very rudimentary access to technology at other times? So this is what happened. And I'm going to start by the end, basically giving you a few pointers that come from a Facebook posting of a very dear friend of mine, Vicky Saumel from Argentina. She is one of the specialists in the use of technology, and she was citing Michael Trucano, and I thought his ideas were mind-blowing. And if you want to know what the lessons learned from what I'm sharing today with you are, these are the lessons learned. The first thing is that the best technology is that the one we have, we know how to use, and we can afford. As you know, many people went crazy at the beginning of the pandemic, and they got into debt, myself included, trying to buy licenses to wonderful applications that after you purchased them, you found out that they were not that useful. So the first lesson learned, and to put your mind at ease for me, is to tell you this. Okay, if you just have email, use that technology well, right? If you know how to use it and you can afford it, don't look for other forms of technology. And I hope that the principles that I'm going to outline here will help you design online activities of quality. Secondly, you need to understand that we need to start from down and out to move up and inside. We were all novices here. No matter how savvy in the use of technology you were at the beginning of the pandemic or you are right now, the truth is that we might have been very savvy, but maybe our students were not. I have the anecdote of a student who had never used email in her life. So her first assignment, she sent it through email. And where did she write the assignment? In a Word document as an attachment? No. She copied and pasted the assignment in the subject line of the email. And the email was blank. Okay? So we need to recognize that we have to start from down and out and move up and inside. We cannot guarantee that our students, because they are this concept that Prensky coined and then he backed out of, the digital native, is valid. Now, I work with teachers, and I learned very soon that if we treat teachers as a problem, they soon become a problem. So we have to trust on the pedagogical skills that our colleagues have. Support them, but trust what they know how to do and help them find out their expertise. Fourth, the important thing here is the content and not the container. It's not about technology. It's about good pedagogy. It's about good teaching that results in powerful student learning, because it's the students who matter. If you are going in the wrong direction, certainly technology will help you get there faster. So one of the things that you have to develop is a mindset by which what you're doing is exploring. As I have said before, we are not learning how to use technology. We are learning how to solve problems or puzzles of practice. We are still novices, all of us. The reality is, to start with, surreal. Secondly, completely new to many of us. So just try to think, what would a good teacher do, and follow that path. Don't get boggled down into apps. I know there are some applications which are a lot of fun, like Kahoot, for example, and then all of a sudden, everybody's using Kahoot. And what do the students say? In one of the feedbacks from the students in the first semester, there was a unanimous, please, no more Kahoots. We are sick and tired of Kahoots. So think about what is good teaching. Anticipate effect. The Matthews effect is a metaphor for the very old saying that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So if you are dealing with public education like I am, and I live in a privileged country, I give it to you, we are all connected. We have the one laptop per child in place since the year 2007. Everybody has their own computer. Everybody has access to the internet. But we have to recognize that not all of our students have a functioning piece of equipment. Not all of our students have internet at home. And when students simply do not participate, it's not because they don't want to many times, but because they can't. So anticipate those problems so that no student is left at a disadvantage. We know that in order to succeed in something difficult, we first have to fail. That is an age-old truth. But what is important here is that we have to learn from that failure. So we are all learners of teaching nowadays. We have to consider ourselves learners again. And because you have taken courses or have used technology before, do not consider yourself a specialist or an expert. Just keep an open mind, understand that there are going to be mistakes, and always think back when you fail, why did I fail? What didn't work? The important thing is sustainability. Sustainability in all its forms. For example, if we talk about motivating our students, okay, we can create an environment where they motivate themselves, because we cannot motivate anybody. We just can create the conditions for them to be motivated. And that's the easy part. The difficult part is to be able to sustain that motivation. By the same token, with participation, by the same token with learning. We have to put sustainability above everything else, because we want our students, we need to have our students have as seamless learning experience as possible. And then we know a lot about worst practices, not best, but worst practices. So let's not replicate them. In the fire of the fight, we might tend to do things which are not learning productive. So these are the lessons learned from what I'm going to share with you now. So that you know what I'm going to present, I'm going to present a class that I taught my students using technology. And then I expected them to learn the tools. We did metacognition about how they learned using these technology tools, how they could appropriate the new knowledge, and then they were expected to try and apply those technology tools to their own teaching of language, to their learners in the schools. And let's start by the title of this talk, which is One Online Activity. And this online activity sort of encapsulates most of the pedagogical principles that I developed over the first few months of the pandemic.
Yes. One quick remark. Just remember, everybody, that you can double click on the window that has the presentation, so you can see that bigger than the rest of our screens, so you can read everything more clear. Okay, just double click on it. Thank you, Dr. Diaz. Sorry.
It's all right, and you can also download a copy of the presentation from the link that Didi has put in the chat.
Correct.
If you want, right?
That's it.
Okay, so what is an activity? When we think of activities, we think of goal-oriented actions. We do an activity in order to participate, to do something, to get a concrete product. And in classroom, we do activities so that our students learn. So an activity is marked, according to Engstrom, by an object. The object in this case is the learners we teach, okay? And those objects, this is classical terminology. I'm not calling people objects. I'm just respecting Engestrom's definition. The activity is oriented towards a motive, and there is a subject. We are the subject, the teachers. So we have to align whatever we do to the needs of the object and the motive that we have in engaging in an activity. Now, an activity, as you can see, also has a community dimension. Maybe we teach individual students, but in general, we teach a group of students. That community has different members who have different abilities, different learning rhythms, etc. And in that community, we divide labor. So students have to do some things, we have to do other things, and there are some rules for that division of labor, for participation in the community, for participation in the activity, for selecting the motive, right? And we do all this through the use of tools. What is the tool? Well, what we do with our students in the classroom, the activity. And this is going to be the center of my presentation today. But I wanted to give you the idea of activity, not as an individual thing, but as a complex system, where you see that the community will determine who participates through the division of labor, so the object will be affected, but also the subject. If you look at the arrows that connect the components of the activity, we are not going to look at each component in place individually, but we're going to see the systemic nature of the activity. All the parts of this activity, how they play out. So back in 2013, my colleague Leslie Painter-Farrell and I coined a term, two terms in terms of use of technology. In language learning, you can use technology for acquisitional purposes, and the characteristics are that anything which is pre-designed, everything which is drag and drop, where there is not a lot of cognitive processing, everything which is screen-centric, what is there on the screen is what constitutes the actual core of the activity. Anything which is coded inside a machine, or which is based on a transmission form of teaching where you give an input, there's a response, and there's feedback, that is acquisitional use of technology. And in general, what this acquisitional use of technology fosters is low-level thinking development. In contrast, we can have a transactional use of technology, where technology ceases to be the aim and becomes the tool. And in that case, the tool is contingent with the needs of the students, right? And the needs of the teacher as well, right? And also the context in which the technology is being used. If you have low bandwidth, you are not going to be able to teach using video a lot. So you will have to adapt your teaching to that. At the same time, transactional use of technology is by nature interactive. It's about people getting together with other people and working together to obtain a product or to reach the motive. It's based on the concept of learning communities. What are learning communities? Groups of people who come together around a convening activity so that they can all participate in that activity. In our case, the activity will be language learning, right? And there are some rules that bind that community. And because the people who participate are the ones who really create the meaning, we say that contrary to what happens with acquisitional technology, this use of technology is people deep instead of machine deep. Everything about the use of technology is found in the people. And last but not least, it is mediated. What is mediation? It's the intervention of a teacher that provides on demand and at the point of need assistance to students so that they can learn. And when they learn, they can develop. So thinking about what we do in the classroom, we can talk about 4 big learning outcomes that we expect from our students. And this is one of the dimensions, the pedagogical dimensions of the activity that I'm going to show you. I simply want my students to understand. So what I'm looking for in terms of a learning outcome is a reproduction. I don't want them to create anything new. I just want to check that they understand or that they practice in the good old sense of the word, of manipulating the different parts of the language or the different language skills or the content, or that they reiterate something using their own words, but basically not adding anything new. And last but not least, I can simply want them to repeat something. So if your goal is reproduction, make sure that when you use technology, you give students ways of copying, imitating, or mechanically processing the information. Now, reproduction is a valid learning outcome because you first need to reproduce before you can do other things. Like, for example, elaborate. If you cannot reproduce something, you cannot elaborate on it. right? So what is elaboration? We may want our students to expand something, to provide an assessment, an evaluation of something, or to talk about themselves. And remember, we're going from reproduction to elaboration. So first they repeated, then they personalized, they talked about themselves. Other things you can do, reaction. Because when you personalize things, expand things, or evaluate things, you appropriate those things. You can later on expect students to react to that by giving opinions or by solving a problem, maybe by values clarification, looking at the values associated to a certain topic or concept. And when we look at our own processes as learners or the learning process of our peers, we are also learning. That is what we call assessment as learning. And that is self and peer evaluation. And I have to say, mea culpa, because I didn't use self and peer assessment as frequently as I should have in face-to-face learning. But I needed to know whether whatever I was doing was effective for my learners. So I fostered that self-assessment and peer assessment. And it's a wonderful way of supporting learning. And then the last thing, right, is creation. And where you ask learners to do a proposal, like create a model or design something, a product, etc. They can invent things. One of the most successful activities one of my students did was to create a constitution for a new virtual country. Students were able to create a virtual country with cities and geographical traits, et cetera, and then they had to write the constitution, and they had to invent everything. You can engage them in projects, or you can engage them in anything that requires that students synthesize knowledge that they have gained. So the learning outcomes are one of the guiding lights in our activity. The other one is the forms of assessment, and I've been talking a little bit about this. I talked about assessment of learning, which is assessment of the learning results, and this is what most educational systems are focused on, because they need, if they are public educational systems, and also if they are private, the system is accountable for what the society deposits in them, which is the hopes for the future of its citizens, right? And we know assessment for learning can be done very quickly online with tools such as multiple choice questions, true or false, correlations, the matching, ordering or completing. We can also include performance tasks, ask the students to do something and have a rubric to evaluate them. Or we can do what is called integrated performance assessment, which is a specific form of summative assessment that has to do with having the students work on a sequence of 3 tasks that target, each of the tasks targets one particular communication mode, either interpretive, interpersonal, or presentational. There's also assessment for learning. And here in the online environment, where we really cannot see every student's face as we see them in reality, in face-to-face contact, we need to incorporate this a lot to know whether what we are doing is effective. So there we have observation, we have checklists, appreciation scales, the assessment bullseye, and rubrics. And guess what? These same tools can be used for the third kind of assessment, which is assessment as learning. The students can self-evaluate by reflectively observing their own performance or observing the performance of others by completing checklists about themselves or others, so forth, so on, and so forth, and so on. The important thing is that the 3 forms of assessment have to be incorporated into the activities. Otherwise, we're losing our north, right? We have some standards that we have to teach too, that we need assessment of learning to be able to check. But at the same time, we need to know if we're teaching correctly and if we're teaching aligned with students' needs and the motive of our activity, assessment for learning. And last but not least, our students have a right to know whether they are learning or not and receive information which is timely about that. And when you look at yourself as a learner, you are learning about yourself as a learner. So that is another opportunity for learning. So 3 kinds of assessment, 4 learning outcomes. And I talked about communication modes when I described the integrated performance assessment. Basically, there are 3 communication modes: interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal. Interpretive communication has to do with reading comprehension and listening comprehension. I don't like to call these receptive skills because there's nothing receptive about reading or listening. On the contrary, they're very active skills that require a lot of cognitive investment on the part of the students. Then there's a presentational mode characterized by oral monologic speaking, like when students use a PowerPoint or they explain a poster, they do a presentation, but it's monologic because there's one student talking only, the others listening. And also monologic written communication. When I write for the teacher, or I write a summary, or I write to another person, but I don't know the reaction of that person. An interpersonal communication mode has to do with oral interactive speaking, like when students dialogue with each other, or virtual interactive writing, like using WhatsApp or sending an email, where you will get a response either through icons or words. Now, a good activity capitalizes on the strengths of all 3 modes of communication. So it's not that today we're only going to read a text and answer questions about the text. We need to really enhance the opportunities for students to use the 3 modes of communication as they would happen in real life. What else do we need to take into account for the activity? The learning modes. And here I would like to quote the work of Diane Lorillard. Diane Lorillard has a wonderful little book called Teaching as a Design Science. And there are 2 words in that title that are very powerful. First of all, design. Teachers, we are designers of learning opportunities. And a science means that there are some principles that need to be put into effect if we want to teach properly. And she says that online, there are 5 kinds of learning that can happen. We can learn through acquisition, we can learn through collaboration, through practice and rehearsal, through research, or through production. All these 5 dimensions of learning can be done using either learning management systems or specific applications, or naturally through the technology you have at your disposal. The truth is that in a regular face-to-face on-site class, our students are going to learn through all these modes. And learning through acquisition is basically when we receive information. That kind of learning is basically decided by the teacher. So you will see that I made the decision of what my students were going to learn. I decided what tools I was going to use. I decided what information I was going to give them because I wanted to attain a very specific motive. I needed my students to be familiar with a particular set of methods of language learning and teaching that they may have seen before in other courses, but about which I was not sure they were cognizant of, right? So you can do that through video, through audio, through books, through PDFs, through lectures, and through demonstrations. The key here is that even though they are learning through acquisition, it's not all about the teacher being at the center of attention. You need to look for ways, remembering which all the 3 modes of communication can be activated. And students should get opportunities to attain progressively more complex learning outcomes through also looking at their learning and giving proof of their learning through assessment. You see how everything is connected. Things do not stand alone. Another way of learning online is through collaboration. And there we use tasks, good old tasks, not activities, not exercises, tasks. A task has been defined as a goal-oriented activity where students use whatever language they have at their disposal in order to bridge one or more gaps. In general, we talk about three kinds of gaps through the work of Prabhu in the 1980s. He defined three kinds of tasks that make an activity communicative. It could be information gap. Some students have some information, the others have the rest. They need to interact in order to bridge the gap. It could be a reasoning gap, like when we do problem solving. So some of them will contribute some ideas, the others the other, and together they will come up with a solution. Or it could be opinion gap. Some of them have an opinion, the others have other opinions, like when we do debates. So learning through collaboration entails the use of tasks and also the use of audio video capabilities. Students recording themselves either in audio or video and sending those things to their peers so that they can engage in interaction. But of course, they can also do presentations, projects, models, synthesis, and evaluation of data if you're teaching students of higher levels who need to crunch data. Learning through practice and rehearsal, I cannot stress this enough. I'm going to talk about the reality of my country, and I'm not going to overgeneralize, but what I've seen many times is the idea that teachers have that because they have presented something new to the students and the students are able to repeat it in controlled ways, they can immediately use it independently. And we know that that is not possible. What has to occur between the moment when the students notice something new in the language or the theory, as in the case of my students, and what they are able to do in the classroom, we need to practice. We need to actually help them manipulate the new concepts or skills or dispositions so that they are later on able to reflectively apply them and not just repeat like a parrot. But practice and rehearsal are not done in general with very strong tools online. For practice and rehearsal, you can use the drag and drop acquisitional kind of activities because students are going to manipulate and repeat. So here, for practice and rehearsal, the main motive of the activity is for students to manipulate and slowly automatize the use of the language, which I know is an awful expression, but it's part of the process of skills development. We can also engage the students in learning through research, and that is completely different from learning through acquisition, because there, we may decide, the teacher may decide what students are going to research, but it's mostly guided by essential questions, and it works best when it is negotiated with the students or decided by students. When you are teaching them something, it's what do you want to know about this? Give me your questions. Okay, what can you do? Well, basically, the good old Webquests that we used to do in the early 90s when computing became more widely available, right? Where you create a problem for students to solve, you give them the sources of information that they need to resort to so as to protect their safe use of the internet, and then students work together trying to find a solution to the problem, which they then present to their peers, right? And you can do that through also puzzle-style tasks, like, for example, the jigsaw tasks. They can interview experts. You can get guests to come to your virtual classroom. And you can also create expert groups, students who specialize in a particular area of a topic, right? And then they share information with other groups. The last mode of communication, of learning that Lorillard suggests is learning through production. And that is most effectively done through projects, problem posing and solving, and also the use of content generating tools like Flipgrid, for example. I don't know if you use Flipgrid. You're familiar with it, but it's a wonderful tool for students to record short videos, to do other kinds of stuff in an interactive way. So we've seen the learning outcomes, we've seen the assessment, we've also seen the learning, the communication modes and the learning modes. And what we need to think next is what is left of this activity. What kind of thinking does this activity involve? And for that, I'm going to go to the good old Bloom taxonomy, though I'm using the reformulated version created by Anderson, Krathwell, and the others who worked on it in the early 2000s. And if you remember Bloom's taxonomy, he talked about two kinds of psychological processes: lower order thinking and higher order thinking. Lower order thinking included remembering, understanding, and applying. And then higher order thinking involved analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And one of the things that attracts me about Bloom's taxonomy is that it makes learning visible because it provides us with specific verbs that show us what students can do or should be able to do in order to attain each of these levels of cognitive of thinking. And they are all like Matryoshka dolls. You know Matryoshka dolls, the Russian dolls, where one is always inside the other? Well, basically, to understand, you need to remember. To apply, you need to understand and remember. To analyze, you need to remember, understand, and apply, and so forth, so on. And then there is the application of technology to learning. Why am I using technology? Not just out of need, right? But also how I'm promoting the use of these tools. Remember that technology is a tool, it's not the end in itself. And for that, I would like to refer you to the work of Puente Dura, and you will see that there is an extensive bibliography at the end of my presentation. Puente Dura created a model called the Sabha Model, right? SAMR. And each of these letters stands for the following. S is for substitute, A is for augment, M is for modify, and R is to redefine. And as you can see, it's a hierarchical organization of how we can use technology for different purposes, right? To transform our teaching or to improve our teaching. And the nice thing about this model is that it encapsulates all the possible applications of technology without making us feel guilty. Because maybe I don't want to transform my teaching with technology. I just want to improve the chances of learning that my students have. So I can substitute whatever I do daily with technology. Now, I might want to augment it, I may want to modify it, or I may want to redefine it altogether. And I think that in the months that have gone by since the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown, we've all done some things at each of these four levels. Let me give you an example, right, of the Sabha model. Substituting. In class, we use course books or handouts. Here, you need to give the students a PDF document because you cannot give them a physical book, right? Or you use a PPT, a PowerPoint presentation, instead of using the board, right? That is just substituting. It makes no difference whatsoever. Students are doing the same thing with the same tools. And maybe for starting out and down, this would be a good strategy if you're not very cognizant of technology. You may want to augment it. So what if you ask the students to record a short video on the topic using Flipgrid, for example, or you give them this PDF and they can look for extra information and then create a text with hyperlinks that enrich that information. Now, if you want to modify, remember these substitute and augment are only for improving, but they do not transform your teaching with technology. Modifying, the students will use the technology in order to do something different. For example, they can create a graphic organizer using one of the mind mapping programs that exist online. And they can collaborate after they have created the mind map in creating together a survey using Google Forms, for example. right? Through the cloud. Everybody agrees on the questions, and they create the survey, they send it off. You see that the role of the students here is much more active than in the other two forms of application of technology. The last one, the redefining the use of technology, is when students, after receiving the answers to that survey, they contact experts to check that the information is valid, and these experts are from outside school, and assess the impact of the topic, and assess the impact of the topic they have discussed in the survey to their lives, right? They will have to write, to listen, to read, etc. So, what was the activity? Well, the activity was the following. We were dealing with learning about student characteristics. We were dealing with the first 2 months of the course, and we were dealing with the history of English language teaching. And I showed them this picture from the New York Times, from an article in the New York Times. And I asked them, would you be comfortable being a teacher in this classroom? We worked with the picture. We looked at what students were doing. You see people sleeping, yawning, not paying attention, playing with paper planes, talking to each other, completely disengaged. And then some students who supposedly are doing the work, or at least they look as if they are concentrating on something. Of course, the idea was no. So I told them, well, imagine you're in an escape room, right? You know what an escape room is? It's a place where you have to solve a number of clues, and every time you solve a clue, you get another clue, and then when you get all the clues, you get the key to leave the room. I say, imagine you're trapped inside this classroom. And one of the things that we could do is look at specific methods that we might use to change the situation. We concluded that students were bored, that teaching may perhaps be very traditional, etc. So we looked at learning-centered methods, which are the methods which are prescribed by the national syllabi for EFL at secondary level. I just gave them a definition of the methods, right? And I asked them to just read the definition. This is like the context. And then I gave them the following instructions. To escape this classroom, first of all, carefully look at the clues that I left in the room. How were they going to do that? Well, I had created this as a series of PowerPoint slides. So I put the students, I was using Zoom, I put them in breakout rooms. And what I did is they would call me when they needed me, and I would share with them one clue. They had to discuss it. They would call me when they had the answer, and I would go into the room and give them the second clue, and so forth, so on, right? So solve the clues. Find the name of the 3 methods I want you to identify, and only 3 methods I wanted them to identify. And I wanted them to send the answers through the chat to me, the private chat. And also, when you discuss the method, when you discover the method through the clues, they have to tell me what the roles of the teachers and learners are for each of these methods. So we all started from the same point. We had a cipher, right? Now, how did I create the cipher? I created it using an online tool. I Googled cipher creation tool, and I landed there. So I input the words that I wanted the system to cipher. And then if you look at the bottom, there's a key, the clue, right? According to the shapes. And basically here it says communicative competence. This is the starting point for everybody, right? Because the goal of learning-centered methods is for students, for learners to acquire communicative competence. Then I gave them this. You Google tool for creating receipts, right, online, and you can get this. You input the information. Now, one of the methods I wanted them to discover was the natural approach. developed by Tracer Terrell and Stephen Krashen. So what I did is I somehow used a thesaurus program to change the words. So instead of acquisition, I put implicit learning limited, the effortless store, 100 instinctive way. Oops, I just noticed I lack a C. I'm sorry, instinctive. Los Angeles of Bliss zip code. And then the cashier was Stephen, and that was playing with the name Stephen Krashen. The customer was L. Earner, learner. And what did the student teachers I was teaching purchase? They purchased the 5 hypotheses, and they got a reduction in tax, a 5% reduction, no, a taxing on it. If they corrected, it was 5% more. If they taught explicitly, 5% more. So they needed to decode all these things from the clues there. If you look at the attainment versus erudition, that is learning versus acquisition, expected progression, natural order, sensor mechanism is the monitor hypothesis, touching sifter is the effective filter, and clear provisions is comprehensible input. When they solved these, I gave them the last clue, which was an article from a newspaper. Again, I went online and said, program or application to create newspaper articles. And this is a cool application because you create your own newspaper article. I wrote language learning by doing, and if you read it, it's all about task-based learning. It's the generality of task-based learning. And when they left, and when they discovered this, they left. But remember, they had to, it was not just discovering. It's discovering, discussing what the method entailed, and what the teacher and the learner roles were. Also remember, 2 clues only here, because I didn't want to overtax them. We were just beginning. They were doing breakout rooms with material for the first time. So, okay. I'm looking at the time because I want to open the questions. Let me summarize it, and this is how I planned it. This table represents all the components of the pedagogy of online teaching, the learning outcomes, the use of technology, the assessment modes, the modes of communication, the thinking processes involved in the application of technology to learning, through the steps of the activity, the ones that I have just explained, reading a summary on ways of classifying methods and approaches, solving a cryptogram, decoding a receipt, reading a mock article, and then summarizing the information. And as you can see, because it was at the beginning of the course, there was a lot of reproduction, but that reproduction was enhanced and made more complex as the activity evolved. And we ended up with elaboration, with reaction, and with creation. In the use of technology, we started with acquisitional, but for the last thing, they needed to transact. And the same thing for assessment. You can see implicit self-assessment and peer assessment, but there was peer assessment and teacher assessment. So assessment of and as learning and for learning. The modes of communication are all integrated. The learning modes are all integrated. The thinking processes are all integrated. And in the application of technology here, because as I said, this was at the beginning, I was mediating their use of technology. We ended doing a lot of substitution, but also modification and augmentation, right? Augmentation and modification. We didn't get to the top tier because I thought it was very early. And also they were going to use these ideas, the same tools that I used to create those things, to create an escape room for their own learners, to learn whatever the cooperating teacher told them they had to teach. So folks, this was the online activity. I've explained the theoretical rationale, and I would like to conclude before opening the floor to questions with this wonderful technology by no other than Bill Gates, who said, technology is just a tool, and I hope I have demonstrated that in terms of my students learning and their learners learning, technology was just a tool. In terms of getting the kids working together and motivating them, the teacher is the most important. And if you look at the last one, you see the references that I've used for this. I just want to give a shout out to slidesgo.com, who furnished me with beautiful illustrations for my slides. So thank you very much, slidesgo.com. If you go to the webpage, they have amazing templates for free. That's another tip. And what I would like to do now is open the floor to questions.
So much, Dr. Gabriel. This was amazing. I think it really helped us a lot. And we do have some questions. So first we had Domingo Aquino. He was asking, how many web tools do you recommend in order to not overwhelm the students?
Well, I'm a little bit of a dictator in that sense. Because I have attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity, whenever I go online and I start using tools, I never do anything. I just keep exploring. And as a form of self-discipline, I gave myself a number, and I said 3. We have a learning management system, a beautiful learning management system, which is used nationwide. It's called Schoology. And we all have access, all teachers in public education and students have access to it. And it has wonderful functionalities, but they are not always enough. So I limited myself to 3 things outside the learning management system, right? One of the ones that I've been using a lot is called Mentimeter. That helps me make my lessons more dynamic because there's more interaction with my students. And then I'm using Zoom in all its capabilities with the polls, with the reactions, with the chat, everything.
Now we have another question from Jasmine Montaz, sorry.
Yeah.
No matter how the teacher summarizes the assignments, the problem is to check and grade them one by one. In a big group of students, how could it be simple or simpler for teachers to grade each task?
I think it's all a matter of your positioning. If you're coming to it from a perspective where you are the teacher doing all the work, then you are going to end up with 1,000 scripts to correct. Sometimes you need to think of ways in which students can work collaboratively first and use those collaborative products as assessment for learning, and not grade them, but use them to help students learn how best to improve their work. For example, I teach in a private university here in Uruguay in the master's program, and I teach a module called Learning Theories. The module lasts for 3 months. So we have 1 weekly lesson, and then after the module finishes, my students have 2 weeks to ask me questions about the assignment. And we do that through a forum, a question and answer forum, right? Through the platform. After the question and answer week, students have 2 weeks to write a first draft of their assignment, and they send it to me. It need not be a complete assignment, the full 16 pages. It might be like a little bit of every area of the assignment. And my task is to give them feedback. So what kind of feedback do I give my students? And I do this same thing with language learners, student teachers. When I give feedback, I use a framework that I call Show That You Care. And it's CARE. C stands for clarify. Whenever I read an assignment, I may ask questions about that assignment. So the first reading I do of the assignment is just reading and sending an email to students. On page 5, when you say, on paragraph 3, do you mean? There are some assignments I don't need to do that because they're very clear. So it's care. The second one is, clarify. The second one is appreciate. How often do you really tell your students all the great things they have done in their assignment? not very frequently. So that is what I do, because I have found out through research and also through practice that when you sort of validate what students have done, that is learning that gets appropriated, right? I always say I wrote my doctoral thesis on a case study of a professor who is that person hasn't died yet. But that person used to always start every feedback with a positive comment. And I remember that during my research, I was lurking in one of his online courses. And there was a student who was really bad. But when I say bad, really bad all around. The person didn't study, very seldom did that person do anything. And whenever that person produced something, it was of such poor quality that I said, oh my God, how is this guy who does the correction going to respond positively to this? So once he created this activity that the students had to write a paper, and he always gave them a word limit, 300 words. And what that student in particular submitted was atrocious. It was poorly written, not informed by theory. It was a disaster. So I said, how is he going to do? You know what that person did? He started by saying, congratulations on keeping to the word limit. And then when I interviewed him afterwards, and this I learned from him, he said, like, how often were you told as a student all the great things that you did? Mm-hmm. So when I created my feedback method, I adopted what my co-participant in research suggested. Then there's the R for reflect. So there I lay out the law. I say, all these things are wrong, and I give students specific indications of everything which is wrong. And sometimes it's a little bit shocking because there are a lot of mistakes. But what I'm doing here is just highlighting the mistakes so that because I assume that if they made those mistakes, it's because they didn't realize that they were making them. But we have a rule in our class, whatever I teach, mistakes are 3 N's, natural, normal, and necessary, right? So they know what they have done wrong. And then the last one, the E in care, stands for empower. And there I just concentrate on the 2 or 3, not more than 3, 2 or 3 most pressing issues that the student needs to improve in order to get an acceptable level. And I give concrete suggestions on how to improve. I don't just tell them, improve A, B, C. I say, I would like you, for the next time you write a paper, I want you to improve A, B, C. For A, you can do this and this and this, etc., etc. So the more explicit you are, sorry.
It is very important what we're listening. I think we can take a lot from this.
Let me get some water.
That's okay. That's okay. So we also have a few more questions. Okay. Just a reminder, we have 3 more minutes, but let's use them. Okay. So something else that Elaine was mentioning, I think it is very important, and it is something that we can take out of this. It is that technology can help the teacher's work improving the strategies.
But what strategies are we talking about? Are we talking about learning strategies or teaching strategies? Because if we're talking about teaching strategies, pardon me, yes, it's true. Okay. We can be assisted in our teaching by the technology. Now, for students, depending on what technology you use, you can help them realize that they are applying certain strategies. And you have, because of the beauty of the medium, where everything gets recorded or written. Sorry, I get nervous and I start coughing. we have documented evidence. We can tell the students, see what you're doing here? No, look, you are using this strategy. The next time you have an activity like this, do the same.
Okay, so we also have another question from Mariana Ortega. What is your opinion on flipped methodology? Are you using it?
I do, and I don't think I need to have an opinion. I think that research has sustained that it's an effective way of creating learning spaces, right? I wouldn't just say I go for flipped learning all around in the same way that I wouldn't use a single method in every single lesson, right? But yes, it's true, it gives us the opportunity to use our class time for what it should be used, which is getting the students to work together.
Mm-hmm. And we have one last question from Irma Guzman. Regarding Bloom's, have you had any experience with Edpuzzle teaching adults, beginner adults?
No, honestly, I haven't been able to explore Edpuzzle. It hasn't fallen on my radar so far, but thank you for bringing it up, Irma, because I'm going to check it out.
And I think we have one more that we can.
No, please.
I think we can sneak in one more question. How about teacher education programs? What should the main focus be in this new reality?
Charlotte Danielson, who's famous because she created a framework for teaching that is used around the world, and it's a research-based framework for teaching, says that the main responsibility of a teacher is to work to happen. And I think that teacher education programs need to move from the way the things are done. Actually, together with my colleague from Chile, Paula Rebolledo, we have just completed a series of research projects applying a new teacher education model based on the concept of core practices that brings together theory and practice. And we have a book coming out next year with 50 activities for teacher education. I'm not going to say where or when, but it's the product of a few years of research. And we have done it in the classroom, and it's a wonderful way. We turned away from how do we teach these people to how do these future teachers learn how to learn about teaching, and creating this idea of communities of practice, very situated learning, and very contextualized learning, reading a lot of local authors more than international authors to replicate practices that are out of our context. So all those things, right? Marcela, it's great to see you. You appear on my screen, Marcela.
It is so nice. It has been amazing to have this talk with you, Dr. Diaz. I think it has, you have provided great tools and also a great perspective on how to use these tools correctly, remembering also what we should remember as teachers and having the best future for our students in mind, and also them being comfortable in our classes, either virtual or physical. Thank you so very much to all of you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present. Honestly, thank you, Change. Thank you, Rilo Andes. Always a pleasure.